the air. It's pretty clear that he would inhale that as he was working without realizing that that's going to disrupt his lungs' ability to breathe. And so he basically ended up dying of lung ailments. He had a doctor, but they didn't have that much familiarity with glass, etc., in the lungs. But Locke doesn't influence Spinoza. Spinoza influences Locke. So that's why I'm mostly talking about Spinoza today. And Spinoza was born of a Jewish family that had migrated to the Netherlands. Remember, the Spanish made life impossible for the Jewish families that were there after they became totally Christian again after chasing the Moors out of Spain. And so his family had moved to the Netherlands. He was born there. If you go to Amsterdam, you can find this statue of Spinoza. Amsterdam is not reacting very quickly this morning. There's the statue. Not a talking statue. There it is. I don't know why it got dark. But, so it's kind of a modernized statue of Spinoza. But as far as I know, Spinoza is their philosophical hero. So that's interesting, I suppose. Spinoza's family, I believe, was Sephardic Jewish. So if you're familiar with Jewish ancestry, two particular groups, the Sephardic, which were from Spain, and the Ashkenazi, which were from more eastern, the Middle East. Am I right about this? I mean, I've done my best to try to find my DNA and hopefully find some Ashkenazi in but no. The closest I've come, and I'm very proud of this, is that I'm 1.2% Neanderthal. Explains the, it's just hilarious. Well, that's a whole nother thing. But in any case, he was a young man going through the synagogue and the training. He was considered the brightest in the synagogue of the young students. The rabbis were very proud of him and his ability, and in fact, the rabbi who was the chief expected Spinoza to eventually take over his position as the chief rabbi and instructor of the young. However, unbeknownst to the rabbi, Spinoza was coming to some remarkable unorthodox conclusions. And once he was old enough and he started expressing his positions, the rabbis were totally upset. He was breaking all their traditions, and as a result, they threatened him. First, they threatened him with expulsion if he didn't change his mind. They also offered him 1,000 talers, which were coins, in order for, or florins, I think 1,000 florins, which a lot of money to shut up. And he nope, no way. He was too interested in the truth as far as he understood it, and so he continued his studies. So they ostracized him. They kicked him out of the synagogue. No one was allowed to talk with him. If you saw him on the street, you had to go cross the other side of the street to avoid him. And as a result, he lost contact, official contact with the Jewish community. And at that point, he took up with a ex-Jesuit, which that sounds really weird to me. It's almost like saying an ex-Marine. You know, I mean, you know, ex-Marines, they're not really ex, they're still Marines. Right? Mm-hmm. They might not be active duty anymore, but they still have that. And Jesuits, I think, are the same way. But in any case, this ex-Jesuit had a school that he taught at, and so Spinoza took up with him, and he helped him learn Latin. And so he became a Latin scholar and learned lots of other things associated with that, including Descartes. He discovered Descartes' works and became a Cartesian. Basically decided that the best way to work was to use Descartes' method, the algebraic geometric method, which we will see when we look at some of his work, and he went from there. Why was he kicked out of the synagogue? Well, one of the things that the synagogue taught was that the Bible was written by Moses. Let me go through here. So he had studied the Talmud. Talmud, by the way, is kind of a study guide to the Bible for the Jewish rabbis. And the medieval classics in Hebrew. But then he studied Latin with an ex-Jesuit, became acquainted with Descartes, Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and the mechanistic science of nature. And he was expelled and cursed from the synagogue because of his heterodox beliefs. But he did not renounce his Jewish heritage. He was still proud of that, but he no longer believed what he was supposed to believe. So I think there were some earlier books. He wrote a book on Cartesian philosophy, I believe. But in any case, his first one, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, actually made him famous, locally at least famous, because it was very good. But he applied this mechanistic science to Scripture. Earlier in the course, I mentioned that, because it came up and we were discussing it, that the quest for the historical Jesus is attributed to Albert Schweitzer. That's where that gets started as far as historically writing is. And that's roughly around World War I. So that's not really that long ago. And that's applying science, the scientific method to, well, who was Jesus anyway? What was his time period like, and so on. But here, kind of what inspires some of that is Spinoza applying that science to Scripture from the Jewish point of view. He's not looking at the New Testament, he's looking at the Old Testament. And he interpreted Scripture like interpreting nature. They study the nature and properties of the language. Who's writing to who? Who's the audience here? Who are the people writing in this stuff? And notice he concludes that the first 12 books written on a single theme by one author, but he thought it was Ezra. By the way, that's not considered right today. But that was his conclusion. But notice Ezra is not Moses. So, there's a lot of interesting reasons why you wouldn't think Moses could have possibly written at least the first even 5 books, because Moses refers, the one I especially like, because I even use it myself, is that Moses refers to himself as the humblest man, which is not really
not very humble.
Not very humble, so I like using that whenever I'm in a group or something. I always point out I'm the humblest person here and proud of it, because that's actually Moses' joke. If it was Moses saying it, it was a joke. But clearly it's indicative that Moses wasn't really the author of those first books, but that's one of the reasons they kicked him out. He's not allowed to think that. Everybody agrees Moses wrote those, except for him. The prophetic books are fragments. That is considered true today. There's lots of more fragments that have been discovered. So that's like not even an argument anymore. So there's plenty of proof for that. And he came to that conclusion not because he was aware that there were other fragments out there, but because he could tell that these are incomplete. There's something fragmental about this, right? The interpretations of God's revelations are flawed. The traditional teachings of the Jewish rabbis are flawed interpretations of these. You can imagine how pissed off the rabbis were over that. So Leibniz ends up moving on to other things, becomes a fan of Descartes and others, and as a result he moves on then to write this Tractatus Theologica Politicus. Eventually he's also going to write his major work, the Ethics, but the Ethics didn't get published until after he had died. And by the way, part of that was because he didn't want people to read it while he was still alive, because he was sure that he would be in serious trouble with a lot of people if they did. But we're going to go and look at that. We can still click right on the page here. And I'm going to go look at the definitions. And now, what's he doing here? He is using the scholastic definitions. So remember, we last encountered these when we were talking about Aquinas. The first occasion for it, of course, was when we talked about Anselm, and we looked at how he's not using this kind of approach. Aquinas isn't using this kind of approach. This is Descartes, and of course Descartes is basing this on actually Euclid. If you're familiar with Euclid, remember we briefly talked about Euclid. You start off with definitions. By that which is self-caused, I mean that of which the essence involves existence, or that of which the nature is only conceivable as existent. If it's self-caused, nothing else caused it. It itself is its own cause. By the way, right from the get-go, you know, I think, that this could only be God, right? We're only what would be self-caused? The table didn't cause itself, right? You know, I didn't cause myself. From what I hear, and I even have a postcard that has an arrow to the room where their wedding night occurred, and I'm pretty sure the next day when my mom sat on the boardwalk and had her picture taken that I was a blastocyst in that person, right? So I'm not self-caused, right? I don't think any of us are. So who is self-caused, or what is self-caused? You might want to just say the universe. What started the universe? Okay. A thing is called finite after its kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. For instance, a body is called finite because we always conceive another greater body. So also a thought is limited by another thought. But a body is not limited by thought, nor a thought by body. This is interesting. Keep in mind that Descartes believed in a mind-body dualism. The mind was kind of spiritual and the body was physical. Notice that these two differences here is that a thought is spiritual, but a body is physical. So he's picking on exactly that same Cartesian difference here, right? By substance, I mean that which, and I don't know if I need to defend that or not. Does that make sense? Something is finite means there's other things that make it finite, right? And by the way, remember, God is infinite. There's no limit on God, so God can't be finite. Right? And that's because there's nothing else, right? Just God, really, if you think about it. I don't want to get ahead, but by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, that of which a conception can be formed independently of any other conception. By attribute,